Hello and welcome to another standard video here in the preview event for Through the Omen Paths, which is the digitally reskinned version of the paper Spider-Man set. I know it's a bit of a mess, but I'll help you through it by putting the paper equivalent cards on screen in the introduction, so you know which is which. So normally this would be a Green Goblin themed deck, but mechanically it's still the same, it's just the names and the artworks that will be different, but you can essentially play the same deck digitally as you can in paper. In fact, we're playing with Norman Osborn, which can transform into the Green Goblin, but the internet has also grown to like Fleem as a replacement for it. So this is a Mayhem deck. Mayhem very similar to the Madness mechanic, but there are some subtle differences. So whenever we discard a card with a Mayhem ability, we can cast it out of the graveyard with often a reduced Mayhem cost, assuming it has been discarded in that very same turn. And there are some different timing restrictions compared to Madness, whereas if you Madness, you instantly have to pay the Madness cost and cast it. With Mayhem, you can still cast the same creature later in the turn, and you also still have to abide by the timing restrictions, so you cannot play a creature at instant speed unless it already has Flash. So Mayhem for the Orb Weaver means we can cast it for 1 mana as opposed to 2 mana. We get a 2/1 with Menace, and when it enters we can discard a card. If we do, put an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and by discarding a card we can maybe discard another Mayhem card, which we can then also cast at a discount. Then we've got a very important enabler for all these discard synergies, which is Quint's Insight, saying at the beginning of our first main phase, we have to discard a card. This is not optional, but if we discard a card this way, we get to draw our replacement, and then whenever we play a land or cast a spell from anywhere other than our hand, this will deal 1 damage to each opponent. So that can also add up, and it's also a way of providing card advantage turn after turn if we can consistently discard Mayhem cards, because we'll be able to still play those out of the graveyard, and we'll have drawn a replacement card to make up for it, filling our hands while casting a bunch of spells out of the graveyard. Then ENT is a card we have from a previous standard set, a 2/2, saying whenever we attack, doesn't have to be with ENT, we may discard a card. When we do, we can put a +1 counter on target attacking creature. It also gains trample until end of turn, and whenever we discard 1 or more cards, we exile the top card of our library. We may play that card until our next end step. So ENT is pretty powerful in a deck that wants to actively discard a bunch of cards. We'll be able to apply a lot of pressure with those extra +1 counters and trample. It can be a little awkward if we exile one of our Mayhem cards with the ability, because we won't be able to cast it at a discount anymore, but it's usually still worth including a few copies. Then we have Goben, which is a 1/1 that cannot be blocked, and when it deals combat damage to a player, we get to connive, meaning we draw a card and then discard. If we discarded a non-land card, Goben will also pick up a +1/+1 counter, so this can also function as a discard outlet for our various Mayhem cards. And then we can later transform Goben for 4 mana into Fleem, a 3/3 with Flying and Menace. If Goben had any +1 counters on him from conniving, those counters will stay on Fleem, since it's simply transformed and is still the same object, as opposed to maybe some of the other transform cards which exile themselves first. And then Fleem's a 3/3 with Flying and Menace, says spells we cast from our graveyard get a 2 mana discount, so that applies to all Mayhem cards we might have, and each non-land card in our graveyard also has Mayhem, with a Mayhem cost equal to its mana cost. Of course, also get to have that 2 mana discount, so that also lets us play a whole bunch of cards out of the graveyard if we can maybe pair Fleem with other discard outlets. Also important to note is that we can immediately cast Fleem, since both sides have their own mana cost, so we don't first have to play Goben and transform it, which is especially useful if we draw multiple copies, so we can keep one as Goben and the other we can cast as Fleem to get around the legendary rule. Then at 1 mana we picked up Knife Trick, which can deal 3 damage to a creature. As an additional cost to cast it, we either pay 2 mana, so then it's 3 total, or we can simply discard a card. So this is another very cheap discard outlet that we can combine with our various Mayhem cards, so we can play those in the same turn. Then Marauding Mako also makes a lot of sense in a deck that's constantly discarding cards, as this will start picking up additional +1/+1 counters. And then at 3 mana, we've got some more Mayhem cards with the Stitcher's Wings, which we can Mayhem for just 2 mana, in which case it also immediately attaches to a creature we control, giving it 2 additional power, flying, and haste. So that's a lot of very useful keywords. Otherwise, we need to cast it for 3 mana and equip for 2, so that's not quite as exciting. Then the ultimate Green Goblin, aka Ruzik, is a 5/4, can cast it for 3 mana, or we can Mayhem it for 3 mana, in which case it becomes a little easier to cast, and will also benefit even more from maybe having a Fleem on the battlefield, giving it a 2 mana discount, so we can potentially Mayhem it for just 1 mana instead. And then at the beginning of our upkeep, we have to discard a card, once again not optional, but we do get to create a treasure token. So if we're empty-handed, we still get to make a treasure token. Ideally, we discard more Mayhem cards to this ability. And because we have cards like Ruzik and Quint's Insight, we don't want to include too many expensive spells in this deck, especially expensive spells that don't have Mayhem, because otherwise what happens, you'll have that card stuck in hand, and at some point you'll be forced to discard it before you can ever cast it, which is not where you want to be. Instead, if your curve toppers have Mayhem, you can easily still discard them and get value out of the graveyard. Then we've got another cheap Mayhem card for just a single black, a 2/2 with Flash and Flying. Then we've got the House Grows Hungry as a saga that first destroys target creature, and then on Chapter 2 lets our opponent discard a card. If they don't, they lose 3, and we get to do the same, but we actively want to be discarding our Mayhem cards to enable our cost reduction. And I prefer the House Grows Hungry over Bitter Triumph, just because it splits up the removal and the discarding, because if we're paying 2 or 3 mana for a removal spell, we may not have a ton of mana left for casting any of our Mayhem cards, whereas with the House Grows Hungry, it's going to be a little bit easier to set up a Mayhem card on the subsequent turn. And then finally, we also get to exile any number of target players' graveyards. And then topping off our curve, we've got a few more Mayhem creatures with the Gift of Servitude, a 4/3 Trampler. When it enters, we get to return a creature with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. It will be forced to attack, and when it deals damage, we have to sacrifice it. Still a pretty nice effect for 2 mana if we can cast it with Mayhem. And then there's the Lava-born Goblins, which we can also Mayhem for just 3 mana to get a 5/4 with haste. So that's also pretty neat if we can discard it before attacking. So it's not quite going to be as exciting if we discard it with, let's say, an Inti or with Goben's Connive ability, because we're not really getting the benefit from haste. But if we can maybe discard it with Ruzik or a Quint's Insight, then we can maybe smack the opponent for 5 on turn 3 already. And then the mana base has a mix of the various Verge lands, which play well with cards like Watery Grave, as well as the new Multiversal Passage, which will also have those basic land types, can choose which one, at the cost of 2 life if we want it untapped. And then Spire Bluff, the only leftover fast land for these colors. And then the Nightclub also has Mayhem, and if we play it out of the graveyard, we lose 2 life, but that can also be a nice way to maybe trigger a Quint's Insight to deal an extra damage, and it also fixes our mana. So yeah, that's our deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Okay, we're on the play. What do we think of our hand? We're missing a discard outlet, unless we count Ruzik at 3 mana, but then I still need to draw land first. So this one's a little sketchy to me. Alright, this is a bit better. So, could keep Mako, Insight, and then this is something we can discard to Mayhem. Do I keep the Knife Trick or not? Yeah, maybe I can afford to if we want to just curve out 1, 2, 3. Put on blue-black. Now I could play Goben first, which is both a threat and a discard outlet. That seems reasonable. If they remove Goben, I can just go tap land plus Insight. And yeah, Shoot the Sheriff unable to take out the pirates, so I had to go for Goben. Alright, now I can still cast Ruzik if I'd like. And then next turn we can discard the Weaver, cast Insight, and then play Weaver with Mayhem triggering Insight. Versus just playing Insight and a tap land. Yeah, this seems better. Maybe black over red. It's a close call. So do we get to untap? That's going to be another removal spell. Bitter Triumph losing 3. The wings I could maybe set up next turn. Since we lost our discard outlet, I can't quite make the play I wanted to. So then, yeah, I guess we just cast the Insight here. And then next turn I can Mayhem the Weaver, which also discards the wings, which then gives us 2 extra power and haste. So that should be a pretty good sequence. Overlord draws and discards a passage. So despite only having a 1/1 Mako, we're about to deal a lot of damage. As I discard Weaver. Find another Ruzik, which I could also go for, but I kind of like the wings play. And get in while the getting's good. And that's now 8 damage. Can play the land out since Insight can discard another Mayhem card. Not entirely sure what our opponent is setting up. Maybe a Reanimator build. Just missing the creatures to reanimate. Alright, could also Mayhem the Nightclub for what it's worth. So now if I cast this, we also get this one back. But then let's see, whenever you play a land or cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, so we wouldn't be playing anything from graveyard in this case. Either way, can go ahead and attack. That's not going to change. They need 2 removal spells. There's one, discard a land. And there's another. Opponent falls to 1, so now just casting this is game over. Although we could have also considered going for our 4-drop, which when it enters gets to return the Orb Weaver, which in turn discards the Nightclub, play the Nightclub out of the graveyard with Mayhem. So we had a few fun lines available. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the play with a keepable hand. Start with Nightclub, turn 2 can play Goben. Maybe discards Ruzik to set up the Mayhem. Could also get Quinn's Insight going, although we're pretty light on Mayhem creatures. So, we'll start here. ENT also makes sense. Although if they have removal, I would rather lose 1 Goben. It's going to be a Town Greeter, so maybe more of a graveyard deck. And yeah. Opponent's going to be cheating stuff into play with Smuggler Surprise. Goblins I can cast next turn. For now just set up the Mayhem. So then I can discard the Goblins, cast it with haste and actually attack with it. Which is better than casting it with a Connive, having to cast it second main. Terra can mill some more. And yeah, goes for the Overlord here. So Terror, Overlords, maybe they're playing Calamity as well, which can copy those creatures. And set up a deadly Smuggler Surprise. Okay, so I can go for Goblins and give it Trample with ENT. So that we can get past Terra. I guess they can still trade for Ruzik. I think I prefer that over trying to play something else. Otherwise I could have played Quinn's Insight before casting the Goblins to get an extra damage. But Yeah, I think I care more about pushing damage than preserving a little bit of card advantage. So then here we can discard Goben. And then I guess it makes more sense to put the counter on Ruzik. So I can discard the Weaver next turn. They could still double block to trade. Which they do, fair enough. But then we got more damage in. And get to connive. And for now we'll discard a land. And then I can still maybe discard Weaver to Inti and cast it that way. So no 4th mana for the Overlord to deal 4 damage. Alright. So proper sequencing. I guess we start by attacking. Discard Weaver. Could also transform this, but I think I would rather play the Insight. And discard Weaver. And then probably don't want to put more eggs in the Goblin basket. Inti can target itself. Opponent had a Carnosaur to deal 3, fair enough. So maybe counter on Goblins would have worked out. But our opponent's at 1, and I've got bad news for our opponent here. Since we can play the Insight, and then playing this triggers Insight, but I could also play the Weaver, which would deal 1 more. Sweet, on to the next one. Okay, we're on the play with a reasonable hand. Hoping the opponent presents some targets for the knife trick, so we can set up our Mayhem cards. Turn 1 doesn't matter too much. I guess it does. Should have played either Mountain or the Blue Verge in case we draw our blue 2-drop. Luckily didn't get punished. So black-white could be a Reanimator. Make that Mardu. So we'll see if Inti gets a chance to attack. Alright, fear of missing out. Fine target for the knife trick, but looks like a Reanimator deck. Discarding a Zombify, so they don't have their target creature yet. Still down to use knife trick. Discarding my Mayhem card, probably. Can maybe still find something of Inti I can cast, or play a land. Is that better than getting my Gift of Servitude online? I guess that would be good too. Even though I'm not returning anything, still a bigger Trampler, so applies a bit more pressure. Right, find the Orb Weaver, which is also an option. Yeah, I guess I could discard another Mayhem card. Although this one I would have to cast for 2 mana, so it's not quite the same. So I don't think I discard anything, I think we just Mayhem and pass. And then next turn I can maybe discard the Hunter and still play the Insight. There's another reasonable target for a knife trick. Do have to watch out for Arden, for instance, getting discarded, since that's a combo with a Fear. Just discards a Faithful, so they don't have their reanimation targets yet. Stitcher's Wings isn't bad. Can combine that with Knife Trick to get in for a bunch of damage. And then maybe next turn we can Mayhem with Inti. Yeah, I like that plan. Maybe find a land of Inti. It's gonna be the Goblins. And get in for 8. Could have put the flying equipment on my bigger creature, in case the ground does stall out, so we get in for more damage. But we'll see here. And And then with Quint's Insight, we can also maybe burn them out 1 damage at a time. So we're gonna see Reanimate on Tersa. So that's back. So then if I just move the equipment onto my Trampler, we have lethal, but just triggering Inti is lethal as well. So a couple ways we can do it here. But yeah, just getting 1+1 counter is enough. Could also put the counter here. And that should do it. Alright, so the Reanimator deck's stumbling a little bit, and we had a nice curve out draw onto the next one. Okay, we're on the play with a fine hand, maybe a bit light on spells. I can Knife Trick Mayhem the Orb Weaver, then maybe set up the wings. Yeah, could use an extra discard outlet, I suppose. But it's probably not bad enough to mulligan. So don't mind seeing an opposing creature, like Alanor Elves. Did not necessarily want to draw an extra land, but discard Weaver. And we can cast it. Could just discard a land for a +1 counter, since we're probably going to flood out a bit. Recorders next. Okay, can play the wings with the plan of equipping next turn. So the Recorder can remove a counter to copy an activated or triggered ability. For now, just a Recruit and another Elves. Alright, so haven't drawn any spells yet. Can fly over for 5, still a pretty fast clock. So glad I discarded a land earlier. And this one can name... Let's go for black. Alright, now the Gearhulk can potentially find some answers. As we see the Reliquary, which they weren't able to play right now. Goblins I can cast for 5, although this does have First Strike, so this just gets blocked. Can still run it out with a plan of maybe equipping it next turn. Yeah, I guess that's it. Although, I guess the Recorder can also copy the Reliquary's ability. So that's maybe a reason not to commit to Goblins yet. And maybe we can sneak it in with haste if we find a cheap enabler. Yeah, because otherwise we're going to see Reliquary, copy, exile both of my creatures. I guess this can also exile an artifact. So they could also get rid of the wings itself. Yeah, I guess that's fine. So there's a Reliquary, sacking the Elves. And activate Recorder. So then I kind of have to hope they leave themselves vulnerable to a 5/4 haste. Opponent does run out the Pixie. Pick up a Recruit. And pass it back. Okay. I'll go for Goblins. Opponent's gonna have to chump. I think I still run out my lands, even though there are some discard synergies where it could be good to keep something else available. Now Cosmogrant can start going wide. So yeah, the flying equipment was pretty important, as it turns out. Inti can give Trample. So I can play it, discard, cast with Mayhem. Find a land. Opponent doing the math to see if they can maybe present lethal next turn. If they only maybe jump with a few tokens. Yeah, we had a pretty strong start, but couldn't really find a relevant spell in the early turns. Did 15 damage with our Orb Weaver. Alright, so our opponent's jumping, can flash this in. And we'll see if they can present a damage. Another Gearhulk. A good starting point. Get another Reliquary and a Seam Rip. Get counters. And this looks lethal to me. Alright, GG's. I guess this one doesn't trample, but yeah, I'm still taking 8. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw. Our hand is a little slow to get going, but once we cast Quint's Insight, we can use it to set up our other Mayhem cards. On the draw, we might be a little slow out of the gates, so I'm gonna keep, but it's far from perfect. Fabled Passage points towards a slower, maybe multicolor deck. Junt colors so far. Alright, I'll play the Insights. Next turn we could add another, or we can maybe Mayhem the Goblins. Opponent ramping with a Regent. Alright, we've got options. Can also go for Ruzek, which in turn sets up another Mayhem card next turn. Yeah, kind of like that plan, as opposed to just hitting for 5. Because then next turn I can hit for a lot more than 5, assuming they don't play a creature that blocks profitably, which is possible. Picked up some removal at least with a Knife Trick. And then getting the extra damage from the Insight's pretty nice too. So then next turn I could discard Weaver, Mayhem it, and then still Mayhem the Goblins. Opponent had removal into Llanowar Elves. So, yeah, pretty straightforward turn, I think. Even though I could Knife Trick the Elves, don't want to give up this much damage. And yeah, the Insight's doing work too. Opponent's looking at the graveyard. And that's because this can potentially get a line back from graveyard as well. 6/6. Alright, can maybe put our flyer into play. Yeah, that seems okay. Could also maybe finish off their 6/6 with a Knife Trick. Found another one. So then I could play the Insight first, and then play this, dealing 2 in the process. Yeah, attacking all out is still reasonable, since it'll slow them down a bit. Can make use of my Knife Trick while I can. And then I could connect with a Weaver, and that damage also matters. So we'll go ahead and attack. Alright, so get in for 3. then Insight, Knife Trick, play Hunter, get 2 more damage. And then next turn I can discard 2 more Mayhem cards, which will deal 4 more damage. So even without creatures we can still cross a finish line. The discard on Quint's Insight is not optional, which is also why you typically don't want to play too many expensive cards in this deck, since you might end up with those cards stuck in hand and then forced to discard. Since I did consider Kefka, which kind of fits the theme of discarding, and of course in the Grixis colors, can maybe be a sideboard option for longer games. Tortoise can get a land back. See the Outcast, another payoff for having lots of lands in play. And now Vigo, a way to get back the Dragon Master, so that's a pretty neat combo. Found the Wings, which I could also discard and Mayhem. Got a few tricks up our sleeve here. Yeah, I could Mayhem this, discard something else. And yeah, our opponent knows the writing's on the wall since we can get in for 2 and then burn him for 2 more. But we had quite a bit of damage to spare. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw with a fine hand. Got some Mayhem cards, some discard outlets. Facing blue-red. And get this tapped Watery Grave out of the way. And an Artist's Talent. Alright, so it could be a more controlling build. For now, I think we play Goben and then hope it survives. It probably doesn't. But I want to be able to trigger Inti the same turn we cast it, ideally, so we can immediately start Mayheming another talent, so they're setting up. Have to watch out for potential board wipes as well. Wild Ride. They could still have a 1-mana burn spell. So I think this turn going Inti and discard Orb Weaver, cast it, could be reasonable. We'll get to Connive, which also lets us discard. So there's a few ways we can go about it. Could go Mako, attack, see what happens. If I get to Connive, I get to Mayhem. Could even Mayhem Weaver and then Mayhem Hunter. Yeah, that maybe has the highest upside here. So let's play Mako and attack. But I don't think we'll get a chance to. Alright, so far so good. Discard Weaver. This also grows a Mako. But I'm bracing for impact if our opponent can wipe the board next turn. Even dealing 2 damage to each creature would be pretty effective. Alright, opponent goes digging with a Scheme. Discarding another Wild Ride. And a turn Inside Out, so maybe more of a pump spell deck. Bolt Wave goes face, doesn't damage my creatures. Another talent, okay. Well, we do have some fun options next turn, including transforming into Fleem, still get to keep the +1 counter. Or we can play Inti, discard, growing Mako, maybe find something off Inti. So I think step 1, play Inti. Wouldn't be able to Mayhem anything for free this turn. And go ahead and attack. And discard a land. Get some counters. Are we afraid of a 4 or 5 damage sweeper? Can't think of a whole lot. Probably keep growing the menace creature or the flyer. Sadly cannot mayhem this for 2. Had we drawn it 1 draw step later, we could have. And I should probably keep a removal spell in hand, even though discarding it gives me an extra +1 counter. And then we get another trigger from Inti, once again finding something I barely cannot cast. But we still had a reasonable turn, just got to see what our opponent has to offer. Since they've been sculpting the perfect hand, we could die out of nowhere. VV. Not sure how much longer it's going to be legal in Standard. Goes for Wild Rides, so they can cast a bunch of those out of the graveyard as well. Well, Inti can jump if needed. Glad I still have my removal spell. Assuming we get another turn. So they already activated VV for 4 mana. And this is their last card, which can generate additional mana. But they might have to play defense. So their opponent passes. We can destroy VV, and hopefully that's good enough. Can keep, let's see, blue-red untapped maybe. Go to attackers. And that'll do it. Alright, sweet. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw with what looks like a keeper. Turn 1, start with Mako. And then got a few ways we can sequence from there. Could even Knife Trick, discard Orb Weaver, cast it with Mayhem. Or we can get Goben going. Opponent on a red-white Spiders deck. Goes for a +1 counter. Lavaborn Goblins, maybe something I can discard with Chapter 2 of House Grows Hungry. And then set up the Mayhem. For now, I'm not opposed to getting our Conniver going. And then maybe next turn we get to set up the Orb Weaver. Okay, maybe wait for a scarier creature to take out with a Knife Trick. So it goes for 3/3 with haste. Can put a +1 counter on an attacking creature. So now I can maybe still finish off one of their creatures with a Knife Trick. Alright. So decisions aplenty. Could start with an attack, see what we draw into with a Connive. Then maybe discard Orb Weaver, and then I can still Knife Trick. Or I can start with playing Inti, and then if I discard, I also maybe get some extra value from Inti's ability. Yeah, there's all to think about. I guess the most mana efficient play would be Inti plus Knife Trick. So let's start there. And then I can discard the Orb Weaver, or I can save that for next turn. Yeah, I guess we'll go Orb Weaver anyways. Counter on probably my unblockable creature. Found a land, so now I get to play the land from exile. Connive. Probably still fine to just discard the passage here. Find another land. So play one, and then I could go for Orb Weaver over Knife Trick, but then I might be taking a lot of damage next turn. So it's a tough call, since I don't really want to discard anything else right now. So maybe I do just Mayhem this, decline, and then next turn I could even Knife Trick, discard the goblins, cast it with Mayhem. So we've got a few more options, but we are taking a bit of a risk. Could also just remove 2 creatures if needed. Opponent attacks and leaves something back, maybe. Just getting in with a 1. Not interested in double blocking. They found a Twitching Doll, maybe missing green mana at the moment. Alright, we get to untap. Possible they have the Spider with Flash that can give Hexproof and Indestructible. Wouldn't be too surprising. So, sequencing is always tricky. Could start with Knife Trick on Kraza, discard a land, trigger Inti, see where we end up. Or I could discard the goblins with a plan of Mayhem. Yeah, let's start by discarding. And I don't think I discard the goblins, even though this is my opportunity to Mayhem. Maybe I should. See what else we find off Inti. A land. Alright, that worked. So I guess I'm down to just Mayhem the goblins then. Go to attackers, opponent's at 16. 8 plus 7 is 15, so with Inti we would have lethal if they have nothing. Maybe they're just missing a color here. Can discard another land. And that also grows a Mako. Counter on, say, the Orb Weaver. Alright, so we managed to turn the corner pretty quickly, although our opponent probably got a bit unlucky here. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the play with what looks like a Keeper. Hoping that Inti survives so we can set up our Mayhem cards. Opponent with a Recruit. Inti this. Could also go Orb Weaver, discard the Hunter, cast it for 1. Alright. So there's a Spider deck of sorts. And an Insight might be a little slow for this matchup. So can go Mako, discard Weaver, and then Hunter as well. Can maybe still hit a land drop that I can play from exile. That one sadly doesn't work if we want to cast a Hunter. Alright, so we're left with a pretty nice board state, and then can maybe set up an awkward second main Goblins. Opponent abrades the Mako. Attacks. Yeah, I can maybe trade here. Since we are taking quite a bit of damage. And another Recruit. Okay, now we can set up the Gift of Servitude, which can get back something from the graveyard. So that looks good. Put the counter on the Menace creature. Find a land we can play. And let's go with Hunter. Opponent says good game. Alright, so we got to see this Grixis Mayhem deck in action, and color me impressed. The deck is able to get on the board pretty quickly, despite not having a ton of 1-drops, but through all the discounts from Mayhem, we can pretty quickly empty our hand. We see a lot of cards with all the drawing and discarding, and then it generates value just by casting spells out of the graveyard, while still being relatively aggressive. And we can also sprinkle in all the needed removal to deal with opposing creature decks. Could always add Bitter Triumph as another removal spell that doubles up as a discard outlet, so that's also a consideration. And if we need to play longer games, we've got Quint's Insight to maybe burn the opponent out. After sideboard, like I mentioned in the games, we could maybe go up the curve a little bit and play cards like Kefka, which also plays well with some of our discard synergies. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to build a Mayhem deck. Could stick to 2 colors, just go black-red, but I think the blue splash has been worth it so far, but would also give you access to maybe some sideboarded counter spells in matchups where those are useful. So yeah, that's going to do it for today's gameplay. Want to thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day.